This podcast is part of the Frederick Podcast Network. Learn more at listenfrederick.com.
Welcome back to Mental Health and Me. I'm so glad you tuned in today. I wanted to tell you about a story my daughter wrote for school a few years back. It was called Lydia the Adventurer. She wrote it for a school contest. In the story, she wrote about how adventurous this little girl named Lydia was. Surprise, that's her name as well. And whether she realized it or not, what she was doing was a form of narrative therapy. She was writing her own narrative, she was writing her own story, and luckily it was a really positive story. Whether we know it or not, we are writing a story for ourselves daily. We do it all the time, whether we verbalize it or not. Sometimes we just internalize it, but we are still writing and telling ourselves a story. Narrative therapy views people as the authors of their own stories. There's a lot of ways you can express that. Some do it through writing, or other people do it, they just speak it, and it externalizes the problems or events in our lives. What we need to do with those stories is to view them objectively. So if you came in to see me for a session and told me what was going on in your life, told me your deepest, darkest secrets, I would look at them objectively, without emotion, and just listen and hear the story you're telling. With narrative therapy, it gives you the opportunity to look at your story in the same way, to see the problem outside of yourself. When we're in the thick of it, in the thick of our personal problems, we often lose awareness. We often lose the awareness of the actual reality. And sometimes we can be really influenced and tell a very negative story about what's happening. Sometimes a narrative in your life can be really dominant, and it can be holding you back without you even knowing it. So if you think about childhood, for example, if you grew up and you believed that you were bad, or you believed that you were foolish, that may cause you to not trust yourself with your decision-making now because you're telling a narrative based on a belief that's just not accurate. So we want to look at the narratives that we've been telling ourselves and say, is something that I'm telling myself holding me back? Is it preventing me from making the decision that I really want to make? The thing that I really like about narrative therapy is that it is non-blaming. So that can really make our problems more manageable. And it also makes us really accountable for our future. So accountability and responsibility are a balance which can be really empowering. So a good example would be, let's say you got into some financial trouble. Let's say you spent too much at Starbucks, you bought 10 of the new Stanleys, and now you realized that you have a financial debt. Well, you don't want to walk around and say that you're someone who's bad with money. You want to separate it and say, I'm a person, but I made an unwise choice financially. I also have the power to make a different choice in the future. So it really separates the things instead of us internalizing that negative piece. We want to just separate the person from the issue. When we do this, it really also helps to eliminate shame and guilt. So you are not bad. Maybe you just did something that was not okay, but that's very separate. Another piece that I like of narrative therapy would be that we can really make that extra thing tangible. So instead of saying, I'm an anxious person or I'm a depressed person, you could say, I'm a person who has anxiety. And an exercise that I'll do in therapy is I will ask someone then to draw that thing. So if you said, I'm a person who has anxiety, I'll say, okay, let's describe that in a tangible term. Let's get a really concrete, detached perspective. Maybe you come up with, the anxiety is a rabid dog and it nips at my heels and it makes me fearful of making any decision making. Okay, so now I've got something here that we're talking about in a measurable term. And then we'll look at its origin. Well, when did this dog first show up in your narrative? What are the symptoms? What's going on in your life when this dog shows up? What do we do or what can be done to make the dog go away? So if we look at it in that sense, it can be very separate from who we are as a person. We don't want to let these things affect our core beliefs of self, so we just want to separate them. Our narratives will influence our identity, our perceptions, our behaviors, and we are shaping our lives by the stories we tell. So whether you know it or not, you're telling a story about yourself. And I will often have people in therapy, and I'd encourage you to do this right now. Sometimes I'll say, what do you like about yourself? What are you good at? What have you done lately that you're proud of? How have you challenged yourself? And people really struggle with these answers. They really struggle to come up with things that are positive about themselves. We default to a negative narrative very easily. Now, if I told you I'm having a hard day, I feel like a bad mom, you'd probably run to my defense to give me some compliments, but you're not really quick to do it for yourself. So we need to look at that narrative piece and say, okay, I can control this narrative. I'm being influenced by external factors in a lot of ways. So let me control this narrative and change it because I do have a lot of power for the future. So we want to rewrite and remind ourselves that we are the ones creating this story. Therapists can serve as a great sounding board for you to write your story. So what will happen sometimes is people will come in and they'll ask me, well, what do you think about this? Was this right or wrong? I don't have an answer for that. You get to decide. Now, sometimes I will help people create pathways and create options for their narrative, but I don't write it. I'm not the one who gets to do that. It should be authored by you. If you grew up being told that you were really obnoxious, you might struggle socially, right? You might have a hard time internalizing a negative belief when you interact with others and think that, oh man, I have to watch what I say. I don't want to do this, or I don't want to say something wrong. I bet they're not going to like me. Do you see how that narrative comes in? So we want to rewrite that. We want to do some things that make us believe that we are whole as a person. Another good exercise for you to do would be to journal just about your day. Maybe you could do just a journaling about your day. Maybe you could just write about some recent experience and then reread it. And look at how you described yourself or described your experience and then ask yourself, what caused you to feel this way? If you wrote things that you did wrong or wrote mistakes, then you want to say, well, is this based on a past narrative or is this based on what is currently true? So I do a lot of writing. Writing has been a hobby for me my entire life. One of the ways that I have come up with writing is to write for a company called Motherly. Some of you know this mom blog. It's really popular. And when I write for them, I just write my narrative of what I'm experiencing that day or in that moment. And I started submitting to them, and I've had a few published. And it's really empowering because I can go back to them later and realize, well, that's not my current experience, or that's not my future experience, but that was the narrative I had at the time. And I've been really active about trying to shape my future narrative. What is that I want to tell about my story by the end of 2024? What is it that I want to tell about the end of this month, the end of this season? And then we look at that and say, okay, we get to choose what the next step is. Another thing that's really important, and I love to think of this term of influencer. That's this great social media topic. And if you know anything about me, you know that I have a social media and I don't do a whole lot on it. But I appreciate the people who label themselves as influencers because they're not hiding it from you. They are out there solely to shape your narrative, either to encourage you to buy something, for you to change something. And when you're looking at these pages, I wonder, do you even want those things? Do you even want that life? Do you even want to participate in whatever activity they're doing? Or is that influencing your narrative? The next time that you decide to sit down and talk about your day with someone, listen to the words that you are saying about yourself. Remember that you are the author of your life story. You can change it at any time. Things that were true in the past do not have to be true anymore. And that you get to look at your situation with a neutral perspective. There's a saying that we are our own worst critic, and that's very true. No one is harder on you than you. So let's step back, look at it objectively. I tell my clients a lot of times to say, well, what would Natalie say about this? You know, I wasn't the mom I wanted to be today, or I didn't do as good of a job at my job as I was hoping I would. Well, what would Natalie say? Well, Natalie would say, did you do your best? Okay, then that's enough. You have a choice to do something different the next time. But we want to just look at something with an objective perspective. We really need to externalize those pieces from ourselves and realizes that we are not just our experiences. We are not just the things that we are doing. We are not just even the positive or the negatives. The things are always changing. The narrative allows you to retell your story at any time, and you get to tell the story for tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today. You can find me on Instagram at @NatalieSouders_ and on listenfrederick.com.
Live radio, local podcasts. The Frederick Podcast Network at listenfrederick.com.